Hello and welcome to the Monday Agenda. The Monday Agenda today is delighted to have an interview with Dr. Victor Yamo from the World Animal Protection. World Animal Protection is launching a report on animal welfare and food safety, and we are here to understand the welfare of the animal and why is it important to human beings, why is it important to animals, and of course, be mindful that we eat a lot of animal and what does it take to actually remain healthy from the food we eat. Dr. Victor, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So before we go on to the report, can we understand a little bit more on what World Animal Protection is?
World Animal Protection is an international organization that looks at the welfare of animals. It has been around for close to slightly over 50 years.
50 years.
50 years.
Okay.
And it operates in about 14 countries, with the African regional office being based in Nairobi. Over the last 50 years, it has also metamorphosized. It was at some point World Society for Protection of Animals, WISPA, but in 2014 it rebranded itself to World Animal Protection. The vision for World Animal Protection is a world where animals are free from suffering and cruelty, and the mission is we move the world to protect animals. And I think I like to emphasize the we. The we is not World Animal Protection staffers, but anybody, including yourselves, the media, anybody who is interested in animals.
What is animal welfare? You've mentioned it. What is it?
Animal welfare, if I use the technical definition, is how an animal copes with the environment in which it lives and ultimately dies. In a nutshell, animal welfare is about the well-being of the animal, the physical and mental well-being of the animal, and it's looked at from a prism, what we call the 5 fundamental freedoms, which then helps us to assess animal welfare. The freedoms, if I can start, freedom number 1 is about freedom from hunger and thirst, which is essentially ensuring that an animal, whichever animal it is, must be fed with a good food and appropriate food for its physiological status. I'm sure you know that the way you feed a child is not the way you feed an adult. So that's the same process. So if you go to chickens, you'll find the chickens, there's various diets for chickens or pigs or any dairy cows, depending on the stage of production or the stage of growth they are in. But very important is water. A lot of us give animals good feed, but forget that good quality water, what we call wholesome water, is available. And wholesome water is essentially water that you and I can drink, just to cut it down to the viewer, so that you're not trying to struggle with it. If you can't drink water, don't put it in the production system, don't give it to an animal.
Do we need, for instance, for those keeping cows and goats in their houses, do they need to boil water for animals? Human beings drink boiled water.
It's not necessary. There are two things you look at in water. One is the bacteriological content of the water. If the bacteria load is too high, then it makes sense to boil the water.
But how does a normal mwananchi in a village know that this water contains bacteria?
Okay, that's one of the challenges that I think we need to see how we address, and that's why in a blanket statement, mwananchi in the village would then opt out to boil water. The other thing that you need to look at water is the mineral salt content, the zinc, the copper, calcium, etc. that is in the water. Again, that's also very critical. It's good for your health, but at certain levels, if it's excess, then it works negatively to the animal or also to you. In fact, at certain levels, it even makes the water unpalatable, which means the animal will not drink sufficiently enough water for its own physiological status.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning the rights of the animals, and you only mentioned one.
I would want to say they are not called rights.
What are they called? Yeah,
they're called
rights.
free. Animal rights is and let me just clarify this so that the viewer doesn't get lost.
Correct.
Animal welfare is a position where we are saying you can use animals, but cater for the needs of the animal. Animal rights is the extreme position where you are saying you cannot use an animal, you cannot eat an animal, you cannot use it for experimental purposes, you can do nothing about animals. The animal rights is an extreme position that says your rights as a human being do not supersede the rights of animals. So for the sake of animal welfare, we then define what is called 5 fundamental freedoms. And freedom number 1 is what I've just said, freedom from hunger and thirst, which is about feeding the animal. The second freedom is freedom from discomfort. It's about the physical environment in which the animal is. Is it a chicken house? That chicken house should be comfortable, should not be too hot, shouldn't be well ventilated so that the animal is not suffocating or getting into other processes. It should be, it should also have a comfortable resting place. If it's a chicken house, it should have enough litter that the animal can be able to scratch, can do what it naturally does. Okay. If it's a pig's house, it should have enough straw so that the animal can still root. The importance of that is that if it's not provided with a comfortable environment, the animal then goes through a period of stress. And stress in an animal leads to release of certain hormones, which then impacts negatively on the animal. I'll give you a good example. If it's a dog, and a lot of us, there's a myth in Africa that the best way to make a dog make it a curly dog, a dog that is very ferocious and aggressive, yes, is to put it in an enclosed space. That is actually not right. Okay. A good dog house must have enough space for the dog so that the dog can go in, rest, lie down, and come out comfortably. A lot of dog houses, kennels that we see across East Africa are so small that the dog barely goes in and has to back out, and it can't turn. That animal goes through a lot of stress, and what we think that the animal is now a ferocious or curly dog is actually a dog that has been mismanaged. And so it is reacting to the stress, and that's why it's going to maul you or bite you or scratch you when you finally release it. So that's the importance of the second freedom, ensuring that that space it's adequate, and ensuring that if it's a chicken house, the right number is in that chicken house. Okay. The third freedom is freedom from pain, injury, and disease. An animal can get into an injury situation or a painful situation because the house was not built properly. Mm-hmm. The nails are jutting, the wood shavings are hard, and so it is very important that whatever we are building the house with caters for that animal. Yeah, if it's a dairy unit, the nails are not going to jut. If it's a floor, the floor is smooth. Because when an animal is in painful situations or injured or in a disease situation, it underperforms. Research done in the local universities, including Sokoine, show clearly that in about 40 to 60% of our dairy units, the floor is so hard that the animal ends up with subclinical laminitis, which is a lameness. That animal will not produce. If it was supposed to produce 20 liters, it will end up producing 15 or 10. Okay. Which means the farmer then is losing because the welfare of that animal has not been catered for. Same applies to chicken. We have seen situations where the litter is so wet that the animal then ends up getting sick because it's picking, wet litter will be foci for bacterial contamination, so it's picking disease organisms from the litter, which leads to subclinical disease, which means that a chicken, if it's a broiler, does not grow as effective, as fast as it should, so the farmer is ultimately losing. And you can see, Austin, then that's where we start losing money. So welfare is also about business. If I'm not doing the right thing, the animal cannot perform optimally. The other reason why the third freedom is important is because of disease situations. There are diseases that can move from humans to animals and vice versa, okay, and what we call zoonotic diseases. The critical thing about that is that in most disease conditions, it's cheaper to treat or manage the disease at the animal population. A classical example, rabies. Rabies is a disease of dogs, but ends up, if you're bitten with a rabid dog, you end up being a dead host, which means you can't transmit it, and if you're not treated immediately, you'll ultimately die. There is no recourse. It is cheaper to manage that at the dog population. You can vaccinate. However, if you don't treat it there and the dog gets rabid and it bites somebody, it will cost anything between $60 to $70 to treat that. And we also look at responsible pet ownership, which is about teaching the general public to understand how a dog should be maintained, what kind of food it needs to eat, how much water it drinks, we can vaccinate, what kind of house that we need to have to provide the dog with. The next one is freedom to express natural behavior. Each animal has its unique behaviors. And when the animal is operating optimally, it should be able to express its natural behavior. Research has shown that the way we, for instance, in Africa, we've been bringing up growing chickens. We grow chickens in a big chicken house with litter and nothing else. But the chicken in its own natural tendency needs to patch, it needs to scratch, it needs to be able to dust bathe. That is how it was formulated.
Right.
If the chicken doesn't have the opportunity to do that, it's not exercising its muscle. So the product that comes out of a chicken in a barren environment is not very good quality product because the muscle has not been exercised. It also means that if there's a problem in the litter, for instance, if the litter is wet, the chicken then is permanently on a wet litter. It ends up, because of a lot of ammonia in the chicken house, it ends up with hawk burns because it's lying on the chase, or the litter with ammonia. So it gets chest burns, blisters, hawk burns, which when you go to the processing plant is condemned. So the farmer actually loses because that's a poor quality product. It will be undergraded or it will be condemned. Lastly, freedom number 5 is freedom from stress, fear, and distress. And essentially it's about ensuring that the animal is in such a comfortable environment that it's not stressed. When, for instance, if you are walking on the street and run into a dog and you throw a stone at it, that dog gets into a state of fear and stress. It will do one of two things. Either it will attack you or it will retreat and run off. And that is part of the reason why that mental status of the animal then becomes critical that we cater for. So that animal is well-rounded and it's not going into situations that causes stress or distress, which then has negative impact on the animal, especially if it's a production animal.
What exactly do you do to as far as the animal welfare is concerned?
We work around a three-pronged theory of change. The first thing is looking at education and mobilization. Animal welfare has been with us as Africans for time immemorial. What we've simply done is we have forgotten our ethos and traditions, and that's why we are mishandling animals. Yeah? If you go back to the old generation, there was a process around, if I had cows, there's a place I kept them. They were not left roaming. In the evening, I provided for them either, if it was chickens, for instance, they stayed in my kitchen. That was the traditional sort of thing. So animal welfare is not new. If you look at our laws in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, we inherited our laws from the British. So the Prevention of Cruelty Act in Kenya, for instance, and Uganda was done in 1962. Same to Tanzania, but Tanzania did a new legislation 2-3 years ago. That's why theirs is a bit more up to date. Yeah, so that's one of the things we do. We look at educating the masses so that they understand the connection between how we handle the animal and the impact on humanity. The second thing we look at is lobby and advocacy, which is principally around engaging governments or international bodies. We are an organization that has an MOU with World Organization for Animal Health, OIE as it's abbreviated, and we sit at that level and look at aspects of animal welfare and drive an agenda that ensures that international standards are developed that make sense to the spaces that you work in. Those standards, when they are developed, we then push them. Like, for instance, last year we pushed for the development of the African strategy African strategy for animal welfare, yeah, which was actually ratified in February by the 54 heads of the states, February last year. And so that is now being pushed to the regional economic community levels. East African communities trying to make their own welfare because it comes from international to the continental and to the regional and then the national. I know Kenya and Uganda have been working with IGAD to develop the national strategies on animal welfare. So that's part of what we do. We also look at things around standards. So we develop for poultry industry, for instance, we've developed poultry industry standards with Kenya Bureau of Standards. We are trying to work with Uganda to do a similar piece of legislation. We also work with industry to develop industry standards so that they can self-regulate around if Austin tomorrow wants to start a chicken house, how much litter should be in the chicken house, what space. Those are standards that need to be documented and be available for the general public. The last thing that we do is catalyzing sustainable solution, is looking at solutions that have worked somewhere and then upscaling them to across, like for Africa office, we upscale them across Africa. So for instance, Zanzibar was a very good case study where we then worked around elimination of rabies, and 3-4 years back, Zanzibar was declared free from rabies. Now we're using that same model to drive an agenda around Eastern Africa, talking to the Kenya, Uganda, and Ghana and Sierra Leone governments to follow the same model.
Again, before we get into the report that you are launching, you've mentioned the way the policies have cascaded from the continent to the blocks to the countries, respective countries. There was a video recently on social media, animal cruelty, and we see them a lot. The one particularly that really moved me, and I deleted it immediately after seeing it, was, I think it was done in Kenya. An elephant was attacked by villagers, and they were just cutting the trunk, the legs. Well, the animal was still alive. You saw that.
Yes.
What would an organization like yours do in such situations? Because I've not, to be frank, I've not heard a statement, not from the government, not from an organization like yours, not from the UN, not from the ministries of tourism and natural resources, but you're talking about cascading information, knowledge, awareness to end cruelty to animals. And then you would let such instances in Kenya, where the headquarters for World Animal Protection for Africa. What message are we conveying to the public?
I know the clip you're talking about. Unfortunately, I think maybe it's not gotten around to you. The Kenya Wildlife Services actually made a statement that was a clip that happened around 2015, and they're aware of it. And the beauty about it is that now they have a clip that shows faces of people who committed that atrocity. And one of the things they could clearly say is that with the help of that clip, now they can actually address the issue, which they failed to do in 2015 because they couldn't get witnesses by the time they got there. But the clip has really helped them. So, but as an organization, what we do, we work with government. So in a situation like that, we might not release a press release because it is not in our mandate, but we would then stir up government like Kenya Wildlife Service and say, well, A, one, are you aware of this? And B, what action do we take about it? That's part of what we do. In a current situation, just to give you an example, we are now having flooding in Kenya, Uganda, and a bit earlier in the year we had Zambia and Mozambique. We were actually the first organization that went out to work with. What happens is we have a disaster program that goes out with the Red Cross when they're going to look at situations where there's been disaster. As they're sorting out human population, we sort out the animal population. And for disaster, we do two things. We can actually do it pre the disaster. So like now we are aware that there was early warning system saying that there would be flooding. So in places where we knew there would be flooding, one of the things you can do is quickly move the animals out, or alternatively, because one of the things that follows rain is you might end up with a disease situation, vaccinate the animals. So those are some of the things we do quietly. In the Kenyan situation where there's been mudslides, we are actually working with the Director of Veterinary Services to collate the number of animals that have lost. Because what I know you quickly see is 37 people, 100 people, 50 people injured, died, but nobody tells you what happens to the animal. So part of what we do quietly is work with the Directorate of the Veterinary Services in the various countries so that they have that information, and then we ask them how we can assist them to intervene. So there's a lot of things we do around that.
Okay. How spread are you in terms of your global coverage?
Globally, as I said, we work around 14 countries globally. But what we do, like in Africa, we are very thin on the ground because the Africa office has 15, 16 people. We work with partners. So when I come to Tanzania, for instance, what I quickly do is to identify people that are prospective partners that I can work with. One which we work with very well is the Vet Association. So I've been in TVA. Last week we were in Arusha with them for the Tanzania Veterinary Association meeting. TVA, We've been to Uganda. We work with Uganda Veterinary Association, Kenya Veterinary Association, Veterinary Association of Zambia. Because remember, animal welfare is closely linked to animal health, which is the preserve of the veterinarians. So that's where our starting point in most cases. But beyond that, depending on what we are trying to achieve, we then work with various other institutions. If it's a wildlife situation, we work with the wildlife agency, and we have an active wildlife program that we run. We work with the national government in terms of all county governments, in the case of Kenya and Uganda, where they are county assemblies. We work with them to develop the relevant laws. We even fund where we need to fund. We collaborate with them to ensure that is done properly. If it's raising awareness, we work with media, and you'll find that a lot of media engagement is basically because we want that information out. It makes no sense to know what we know and it's not being churned out, disseminated outside. Yeah. And that's why we then engage media. Media advocacy is one of our big things. Then we have volunteers, where anybody who's interested can actually become a volunteer, so that if we have a situation, you can be engaged. If it's not a situation, one of the things we do very well with the volunteers, which is becoming a big thing, is to pass information. So we would put you on our digital platform. Every month we would send you a newsletter, an update of what's happening. When you have situations like the elephant, where you've seen something, you can get back to us. We can quickly then tell you this is what has been done, or this is what is happening, and you can see how you can engage. So it's a whole layer of things that we're looking at.
So let's dwell a little bit on the report now.
Yeah.
What are the key highlights of the report? But probably before we look onto the highlights, I understand that this study was conducted in 4 African countries. So just give us a little bit of the background and the highlights from the report.
The genesis of the report is we have been working with the poultry and pigs industry, trying to develop certain processes around policies to ensure that the food that gets onto your table is wholesome. It will not have anything that is detrimental to you. And so part of what we did is, a year ago, we looked at policies, we looked at industry relations, we looked at the value chain. And one of the things that clearly came out was it is difficult to change industry, but if you sensitized the consumer and they were aware of what they need to be looking out for, then they would be able to push the agenda of pushing big integrated companies like the big chicken producers or pig producers, for that matter, to do certain things which are ethically right. And so what we did in May, June, and July, we sent out a questionnaire to 4 countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia, because those are the countries that the farming work is predominantly being done currently. Okay. The questionnaire was sent out by either getting boots on the ground who can actually administer it around supermarkets, exhibitions, anywhere you could find people, because all of us are consumers. And for those who are a bit digitally savvy, a digital version of it was sent. We ended up with about 1,346 people responding to the questionnaire. 20% were in Tanzania. Okay. At Zambia also had about 20%. Uganda had slightly more, maybe about 30%, and the difference was in Kenya. So what we've then decided to do is to then launch that report, highlighting what people know, because the gist of the study was to ask people, do you know animal welfare? Do you know that animal welfare has an impact on the quality of food that comes to your table? Do you know that animal welfare has an impact on productivity? And then pushing it a bit further, do you know that animal welfare also has an impact on livelihoods? But as we are starting that, we then realized that one of the big things that the world is dealing around with is about food safety, and specifically around antimicrobial resistance. We are having drugs that cannot work because we are eating low level of that drug through either milk or eggs or meat, any of the meats. So essentially that was the thing we were trying to gauge, to understand whether the African population is at the same state with the rest of the world. And so May, June, July, we did the questionnaire, we then analyzed, and what predominantly came out is a series of things. One, there's very differing level of awareness between the 4 countries, for obvious reasons. In a country like Tanzania, when we left in 2014, we might not have engaged as much as we would like to, and that's part of the reason we are coming back to start that engagement. In countries, the other thing that came out is that while there could be legislation in place, like in Tanzania again, the people are not aware of those legislation.
Right.
Yeah, and for instance, you will see animals being carried on a motorbike, hanging upside down, which is an illegality in the laws of even Tanzania, but people are not aware. So that gives us an opportunity to then restructure our programming to then tackle There's those gaps that have been identified. But essentially, in a nutshell, across the 4 countries, what came out clearly is that people are saying, one, we'd want to eat food that is wholesome. It has no additives, it has no chemical preservatives, it has nothing. It was very interesting that while we were doing this survey in Kenya, we had a series of 2 things that came from one of the TV stations, one called Red Alert, which was looking at additives being added to preserve meat, and White Alert, which was looking at things like mycotoxins that are coming through the milk, simply because when maize gets rotten, we then put it into the feed system, forgetting that the cow will just concentrate that maize and put it back either in milk or eggs. Yeah? So that's some of the things we are looking at. And so people are beginning to get that awareness. And as I showed in the presentation that I did, there are also research being done in Tanzania. You saw people talking about antibiotics in milk. If you go look around, you'll find antibiotics in meat. And the question we are now then asking and getting people to get interested in is, why is this meat having antibiotics? Is it a failure in the system? Is it that something government should address? Are there laws in place that need to address that? So that was the one big thing. The second big thing is people are then beginning to say they don't like certain things. For instance, how we are transporting our animals or how we are slaughtering them is causing concern. Just like you said, when you're struggling with an animal, you are hammering with a hammer. In some of these slaughterhouses, they hammer it with a hammer. It's not a good sight. That animal will die a painful death, which means that that animal will end up with a poor quality meat, because when they release adrenaline into the meat hardens. So while sometimes we say that it's an African animal that's worked so much, it may be the welfare of it. The way we killed it made it release adrenaline that made the meat harden. Hard meat does not last for long, so it means it's also not good quality meat. Yeah. So those are some of the things that are coming out. The other thing that came out clearly was the awareness gap. And one of the things we asked was, whom do you trust? If we were to put information out, would you trust a physician or a doctor, a research scientist, the media? We looked at both international and local media. And what came out quickly was that the most trusted people are the research scientists and the physicians. The least trusted people are the government. Across the 4 countries, government was the least trusted, and then the butchery, which was very interesting, that 70 to 80% of meat is bought from butcheries, but down here we are not trusting that very butchery that we are buying for. So how are you going to ask questions and interrogate the source of your meat if you're not even trusting the information they're giving you? So those are some of the initial interesting data coming out of it.
And how did you select your sample group? I know you did the study in Dar es Salaam and Arusha, but why Dar es Salaam and Arusha?
That was a relatively a decision that we just made, that we would concentrate on the big cities. So in Kenya we did Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa. In Uganda we did Entebbe, Jinja, and Kampala. And here we did Dar es Salaam and Arusha. We debated about Dodoma at certain points, and then we just said leave it. Yeah. And it's not, of course, what we were looking for was initial data. If need be, we would be extending it. Just like I said again in the meeting, we have now decided, because we want to understand what we mean by a butchery. Is it the butchery that is in a supermarket? So we'll be doing another further work around butcheries and the level of understanding about butcheries.
Who are you targeting in terms of the reports? Not directly the consumer. You're certainly talking to the policymakers. Yeah. You've spoken to the media through the launch and everything. But who do you want targeted, and what is the message you're bearing to that person?
Our main target is actually the consumer. Because if the consumer then knows that some of the things they are doing is actually helping or driving the process of what they do not want, we are reminding them that they have power. Remember that we talked about we do petitions, so they have the power to petition the relevant authority to do certain things right. But the big reason why we are targeting consumer is because if the consumer are aware of some of these things, they can actually make their buying decisions, intelligent buying decisions that are knowledgeable with information. So for instance, if I know that a poor chicken house leads to disease, which leads to antibiotic use, which ends up in my plate, then I could quickly start looking at where my supplier is getting the chicken from, for instance. So that's one level. We are hoping that when the consumer is enlightened, they will push an agenda that forces industry to do certain things right, to create the relevant policies where they already food safety regulations, follow them through. Because one of the things that we must realize is that we're also operating in an international market. And part of the challenge we as Africans need to start looking at is the fact that big brands, and the report shows which big brands are sitting where. So in Kenya, you have Carrefour, you have ShopRite, you have Game, you have big supermarkets, you have big fast food restaurants, KFC, Burger King, etc. They have requirements around food safety. They have requirements around animal welfare. So if you're not going to meet those requirements, it simply means that we end up losing high-value markets, which then is an economic problem for our countries.
Just again to understand, Tanzania ranks number 2, 3, or 4 with the number of with many animals in Africa.
Yeah.
We rank very highly.
I agree.
Instances, most animals are not taken to slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
Not only that we have very few, but the procedures, and it's just cumbersome. So what people do in Tanzania is they would, rear the pigs, slaughter them from their own little settings. People would probably go to their houses and buy, purchase from there. Is that safe?
There are various ways of tackling the issue. One is what I said, working with industry so that industry is aware that there are certain standards that they need to be looking at. But two is also talking to, I also gave you an example, we talk to the veterinary associations when they have their annual general meeting, because they are the custodian of animals at the ground level. If I am going to slaughter an animal, I will need a meat inspector.
This is the formal sector.
Yes.
The
But
informal, which is the majority
Yeah.
now, they would probably not even have the knowledge that we have the vets.
Exactly, and that's why we do this engagement, because in an ideal situation, the laws of this country, I am sure, says that it is the responsibility of, when the animal is slaughtered, a meat inspector must pass it as fit for human consumption.
Law is one thing.
That's why I'm saying.
Yes.
So part of it is then to sensitize people to appreciate why that law is in place. And I know there's gaps in our laws, not only in Tanzania, but across the 4 countries. So part of the appreciation is that fact that the reason why we have a meat inspector or an inspection process is because that's a technical man that can identify potential problems and stop problems from going out. In Kenya, where I come from, we've had people dying from eating meat because it was not inspected and it had anthrax. So those are some of the things we need. And it's one of the things we do is about behavioral change. And behavioral change is not something that you do once and stop. It's consistently repeating the message so that people understand, and that's why we are consistently in media. We will go to any space where we can find an exhibition, a conference. These days every month I do at least 1 or 2. I've been in Dar es Salaam for a big exhibition, poultry farmers, just a general exhibition, to just continue hammering the information. Yeah. The other thing we do is, as I said, we are building a movement. And part of building a movement is that we're ending up with a platform, a digital platform, which is now an SMS platform that has, at the last count, 30, 40, 50,000 people across Africa. So anytime we send a message, an alert, when, for instance, we know something is going to happen that needs to be alerted, that has helped us a lot, because when you send an alert, it quickly is disseminated into the various WhatsApp groups or email groups or Google groups. That's the other level. The next level is going to the ground itself. So right now, as I'm talking here, I have a colleague out in Sierra Leone that is talking to villagers around dog population management, what they need to do, teaching teachers so that the teachers can carry the message as TOTs. So there's various things we are looking at. It's all about how we then plan and what we'll, and that's why in any engagement we go through, we ask people who are interested to support us and to work with us so that they become the food soldiers. Yamo might be one in Africa, but if I have 20 of myself, people who are willing to support the farming work in each of the African countries, then we have some basis to drive our agenda into the next few years.
Things of health, things of what we eat and how we, the culture of eating and the conduct and the practice normally get to be a bit sensitive. We've not looked onto the issues of nutritional health. We've not looked onto the issues of balanced diet. But again, the Monday agenda is only 45 minutes. So I'm left with only one question to ask you. What then role can Tanzanians play to ensure the welfare of the animals? What's your call? What's your end call through Capital TV?
We see these things, but I think as Africans, we tend to be timid. So one of the things we're asking people is when you see a wrong being done, yeah? And a classical example I usually give, if you see your neighbor not feeding his child well, would you keep quiet or mishandling his child? And the animals that we have around us are animals that we were given by God to oversee. So if we are mishandling them, the law requires us to report. And it's just a phone, you can text the relevant authority. In each of the wards in Tanzania, I'm sure there's a vet officer. If you just went to the vet officer and raised the issue, the process can be started. But beyond that, it's about holding each other accountable, so that I think one of the mistakes we make is we make law too punitive. That's why we avoid it. It's about educating people to understand if I treat the animal well, then it's beneficial to me, so that we are not just punishing people, but people then learn and understand. So for instance, if you appreciate the fact that if I feed my chicken well and put it in a good environment, I end up with better productivity, then it's beneficial to you, and I'm sure you're motivated to keep it well. But if you are not getting that concept right, then you will struggle with that process. So my rallying call is, a happy animal is a better animal to have as a pet. A happy animal is a good animal and will produce optimally and will give you good quality products, which gives you better returns. So as World Animal Protection, we are saying it's about the animal, ensure that its welfare is optimal, and it will be a very good companion or food or whatever you're using the animal for. Thank you.
That is Dr. Victor Yamo from the World Animal Protection. From his very powerful end remarks. Thank you for watching the Monday Agenda, and thank you so much for coming to the program.
Thank you.
Until next time, I'm your host, Austin Makani. Stay in touch.